San Francisco's iconic Golden Gate Bridge was shut down by dozens of pro-Palestinian protesters yesterday morning, starting around 7:30 a.m. The protests also forced I-880 in Oakland, California, to close to traffic for hours. Nearly 300 protesters blocked the southbound side of the highway. Now, some protesters chained themselves to 55-gallon drums filled with cement across the bridge. The bridge reopened just after noon. Now, across the country, protesters fanned out to block roadways in Illinois, New York, and other parts of the Pacific Northwest. The protesters said that yesterday's demonstration was part of a global economic blockade to free Palestine. The organization, 15 Action is the name of the organization. They coordinated this blockade, saying that it targeted points that would disrupt economic logistical hubs. One Golden Gate protester said yesterday was chosen as a day of activism because it was tax day, saying that April 15th, 2024 is the day that millions of Americans pay their taxes, and for many people of conscience living in the United States, this day is especially significant as we know that this country gives away billions of our tax dollars straight to the Israeli occupation forces. Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton encouraged those who were blocked by the protests to take matters into their own hands, writing on X, "I encourage people who get stuck behind the pro-Hamas mobs blocking traffic to take matters into your own hands. It's time to put an end to this nonsense." A few minutes later, the tweet was edited to say, "Take matters into your own hands to get them out of the way." The California Highway Patrol said that 38 protesters were arrested and faced charges including unlawful assembly, refusal to comply with lawful orders, unlawful stop on a bridge, resisting arrest, false imprisonment, and conspiracy.
This all comes as the United States Supreme Court declined to hear a case yesterday that would have affirmed that the First Amendment protects protesters and protest leaders from being held liable for any actions of a third party that they did not specifically direct, authorize, ratify, or intend. Now, this decision to not hear the case, McKesson versus Doe, leaves in place a lower court decision that, quote, effectively eliminated the right to organize a massed protest in the United States of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. In the Doe case, a Louisiana police officer filed a lawsuit against a Black Lives Matter movement leader who organized a protest in 2016 where a police officer was severely injured, not by the person who's being charged in the case. A circuit court ruled in favor of the officer. Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote a statement saying that although the court did not hear the case, the decision expresses no view on the merits of the First Amendment. So this is an enormous deal. Effectively, the right to organize a protest has been criminalized in 3 states in the United States of America, all because a police officer who was injured during this 2016 protest. There's no allegation that McKesson directed anybody to do violence against him.
There was someone other than McKesson, which I think is very key
that is important, but also that he did not. There was no allegation that he told people to be violent, that he directed this individual to be violent, that there's any connection between McKesson and this person at all. And the Supreme Court in the past has been very clear about the law. Third parties cannot implicate someone just for organizing a protest. You can imagine where that would lead. If there were a false flag, anybody could run up to any protest, cause problems, and say, oh, now it's, let's say, Donald Trump.
Right, I was going to say, would it lead to trying to put the former president in jail for hosting a rally?
So so apparently, since long before the 2020 Black Lives Matter protest, the Fifth Circuit had apparently, Vox framed it as they've been having a vendetta against DeRay McKesson. DeRay McKesson, back then, he's pretty much faded out of the public eye, but back then was perhaps the most name-recognizable Black Lives Matter participant, leader. I'm avoiding the word leader because even within the movement, there were concerns that he had an outsized importance, that he was kind of using it for his own kind of personal advancement. I think he's landed at the Pod Save America Cruise Crooked Podcast Media with a show there. So whatever you think about him as an individual, he's been used to create very, very bad law. And whereas the standard for when somebody can be liable has historically been very clear, this court has basically said, well, here's some other circumstances that we think justify overturning that previous standard of having more direct involvement, and say, well, because you organized the protest in front of a police office, a police bureau, what do you call it?
The precinct.
The precinct, that justifies eliminating all the protection. So now the courts can decide we think this particular kind of building or this particular kind of public space is protected, so I can't occupy the public space outside of a police precinct.
Right. So I agree. I think it would be important to clarify, as Sotomayor tried to do in the statement she put out there, that the standard should still apply, that if you want to sue the person who threw a bottle at you or injured you, that's totally fine. But the organizers you're essentially limiting their free speech rights, because you're saying, well, they can be held liable for the actions of another party. There needs to be some serious limiting principles there in terms of, well, is it an organization where the person who did it is being paid by you? Is there some kind of liability you're taking on in those cases where maybe we could find some common ground? But that absolutely First Amendment and free speech would be imperiled. Conservative people should recognize this, because actually the Trump metaphor is kind of apt here in terms of all of the rhetoric, at least. I know they're actually ostensibly going after him for some of the pre-January 6th criminal aspects as well, but the rhetoric from MSNBC talking heads about Trump's culpability for the things he said, even though he did not specifically call on any of the protesters to engage in a specific criminal, violent, unlawful action. He said, march strongly, et cetera, and be peaceful. So I think this is very bad and invites, hopefully, at some point, further clarity from the Supreme Court that you can, in fact, engage in protest and you won't be held liable for someone else's actions.
And taking that Trump analogy just a little further, the court says, well, if DeRay McKesson had tried to dissuade some protesters, stole water bottles from a store, if he had actively dissuaded them from doing so, putting his body between the protesters and the water bottle, then he wouldn't be liable. And the Trump analogy, what if Trump gets off the podium, goes to the heart of the Congress and starts pulling people away from the door saying don't go in? That's the only way he could avoid culpability here in this analogy. Right. It's quite obviously absurd.
Right. And again, it's rhetorically, if you want to say, so many people are saying Trump is morally responsible because he should have known that was going to get out of hand and the things he weren't saying was true. I don't know the specific aspects of what happened with McKesson. I don't know what he said and what his activities were there.
There's no even allegation that he said to be violent.
Even if there was, you can make whatever moral claim about somebody's culpability, but that is different from what the legal standard should be. And should you be able to be fined, sued, jailed, those kinds of things, obviously we want the case to be no.
So getting back to these most recent protests, they very effectively targeted points that would basically squeeze communities economically, squeeze municipalities, because that is the underlying theory of labor action, that the only way to get your employer to give you rights and to listen to you is to hurt them economically, that these kind of peaceful protests that people get pushed into and which are validated by the mainstream, the establishment, the people in power, are validated precisely because they know that they can be ignored. And so the escalation to these kinds of traffic shutdowns are precisely because of how easy it is for other kind of protests to be ignored, and they seem to have had the desired effect. Now, the biggest controversy coming out of this is you have Tom Cotton. Now you have members of Congress coming out and say, inciting actual violence, I would argue, saying take things in your own hands. People should get out of their cars and take things in their own hands. I mean, you seem skeptical about that. What do you make of that? And if he didn't see that as an incitement of violence, why do you think he then edited his tweet to try to soften it somewhat, saying take things in your own hands by getting them out of the way, as opposed to what? By killing them? I mean, what could he have meant by the first?
Well, so I don't think he should have said that, to be clear. I don't know that it's an incitement to, again, it might be an incitement to justified and necessary violence to move someone out of your way. They don't have the right to just block. Well, they're not justified in blocking traffic.
You have the right to hit someone when they're standing in your way?
You have the right to move them out of the way.
No, the police might have a right to do so, but you as a civilian do not have a right to start enforcing vigilante justice on people who you believe are breaking the law.
Okay, you can. I have no problem with someone moving someone out of their way if they're blocking traffic.
All right, well.
I suspect the vast majority of people do as well. Maybe it's better to leave it to police. I would validate that viewpoint, that the best thing to do is probably to wait for the police. Do I think you should be morally justified in doing something of your own accord? Absolutely.
All right, well, you just talked about what was morally justified and what is legally justified being very different. And I think assaulting people is against the law.
Okay, blocking traffic.
All right, so let the law take care of the law. You don't get to escalate and break the law by doing a
I
more
agree.
serious crime of assault
there would
because
be
someone
no
is blocking
need to.
traffic.
There would be no need to, if that is breaking the law on the terms of the people trying to remove them. There's no need for that to happen if the protesters would be following.
Yeah, and there would be no need for protesters if 33,000 people hadn't been killed in Gaza.
Well, look, I don't want to pay my taxes. I'm totally sympathetic to that. I don't want my tax dollars going to any of these causes. You want to make this about taxes? That's fantastic to me. I still wouldn't block traffic over it because I'm not going to inconvenience other people who are also being forced to pay their money for these causes and might not support them. And I don't think this does anything but make the protesters look awfully.
And for hundreds of people who were involved in this protest, their priority is that there are hardly any roads left in Gaza. When you drive down a road in Gaza, you risk being bombed by the IDF, as the 7 Jose Andres food workers were massacred on a road, on a coastal road, where they had full coordination with the Israeli government. It did not keep them safe. We just covered a story earlier today about a 5-year-old being shot in the head because she was passing through a checkpoint. That's what happens when you try to commute back to your home in Gaza. And the point of these protests is to say, as inconvenienced as you are today, shouldn't you be exerting pressure on your own government to make sure that the much more than inconvenience, the death and destruction,
on government or the pressure on people trying to commute?
The death and destruction that your government is doing in your name should come to an end. And so the ire from these sorts of scenarios, I think, should be rightly focused on what's motivating them, which is the government's actions.
It seems to me the activists are saying there is immense suffering happening elsewhere in the world, and we're going to make you feel some suffering as well. And I don't think that's a very effective tactic, but people can decide for themselves and let us know how they feel about it.
I side with the people who successfully implemented the Montgomery bus boycott, which was very inconvenient to commuters, but that was sort of the point.
All right, more Rising right after this.